one of the leaders of the Wiccan Pagan community, one of the elders, I would say, since she has been in the community as long as anybody almost, I think. And well, yeah, you know, but I don't count because nobody thinks of us as witches, you know.
Right.
We're the witches who give away the secrets, and we're not really witches. So anyway, Margot, have at it.
Well, I thought I would start this tape just telling people a little bit about how I ended up in this odd religion and what my background was, and I really want to talk about what I think are some of the principles of the contemporary pagan movement and why the movement is really important. But I want to start by saying first a little bit about myself so you'll know how I got here and why and what for. I'm at this point when I'm making this tape, I'm 49 years old, and I grew up in New York City. I was actually born in Little Rock, Arkansas, but I grew up in New York City. And I grew up in what would be called, could only be described as sort of an atheist, Marxist, semi-Jewish, non-Jewish home. It's the only way I could describe it, in the sense that we celebrated Christmas, but we're atheists, but we're Jews, you know. I mean, it was extremely odd. And when I was 5, my father, basically when I finally said to him, you know, Dad, what religion am I? He said, we believe in the brotherhood of man. Now, even at 5, I knew that this was boring, that this did not exactly cut it. And immediately when my one of my best friends, who was Catholic, went, you know, a few years later to her first communion, and she got the white robe and the veil and everything, I thought she had a much better deal going at the time. Of course, that was in the days when the Mass was still in Latin, and so you could go into these Catholic churches with your friends and be immersed in the incense and the ritual and have not a clue of what they were saying. And so I would sort of transport myself back into the Middle Ages and sort of live out these fantasies by going into Catholic churches. And so I guess way down deep, without knowing it, I was a ritual junkie. But I had no way of sort of fulfilling this deep love of ritual. And so then when I was about 10 years old, a sort of seminal, or I guess from the feminist point of view, ovular or whatever, event happened in my life. And that is, I went to this very crazy school in Greenwich Village. I actually went to the school that, if you've ever seen the film Anti-Mame, you will know that there's a school that they mention in there where the nephew goes, where he's sort of seen running around naked and they pull him from the school. That was my school. It was called the City and Country School. It wasn't quite that outrageous, but it was a very old line progressive school. And they, when I was 10, they spent half the year studying the Middle Ages and half the year spent studying ancient Egypt. And during the Middle Ages part of the year, they taught us all these medieval May Day carols, and they basically had us brought to school by our parents on the 1st of May. At 4 a.m., my mother took me on the subway at 4 a.m. There, I even remember to this day, there were bakers and painters in their sort of garb on the subway, and we got to school, and they took us out in a car to, I guess, the sister of some teacher, and there, as the sun rose on the 1st of May, we gathered flowers and picked flowers as the sun rose, and we came back to school singing May Day carols, you know, a branch of May I've brought to you, and at your door it stands, 'tis but a sprout well bedded out, the work of godly hands, you know, and all that. And we sang these songs and strewed flowers around the school, and then we danced around the maypole. And I was in ecstasy. I knew then I was a ritual junkie. I absolutely knew. I mean, it was clear at that moment that I had found something that I was the most, you know, ecstatic moment. It was just wonderful. And then 2 years later, after that, the same school spent the whole year studying ancient Greece. So I was 12. This was 1957, something around then. And there weren't a lot of images in the culture in the 50s, as probably many people know, that were positive, strong female images. So there I was at 12 in my old progressive school, studying about Artemis and Athena, and they were hot. And I loved these goddesses. I thought they were, the greatest thing to come my way in a long time. And in this school, which was wonderful, one day, I even remember, they invited a 92-year-old woman to come and have tea with us, and it was Edith Hamilton. People today have probably never heard of her, but she was sort of she was the Campbell of our time. She was the mythographer of our time, and she came to our school, and we had tea with her when we were 12 years old. And so the Greek gods and goddesses became almost everything to me. And we even, a friend and I even wrote a play at the age of 12 about the Trojan War. And I actually, one of the most incredible experiences that I've still never forgotten is, at that time I thought that I would be a singer. That was probably, I knew from a very, very early age that music was sort of my pathway. And I went to the High School of Music and Art later, and then for various reasons like the politics of the 60s, I did not do that. But I was very involved in singing and very involved in music and even composing music and so forth. And we had a fabulous music teacher, and he came to my house, I'll remember one day, and this boy and I, this young boy named Peter Walker, I'll never forget it, we had written this musical about the Trojan War when we were 12. And he had written the words, and I had written the music. And he had written a prayer to Zeus by Priam as the walls of Troy are falling. And Priam sings the song to Zeus. "O mighty Zeus, king of Olympus, hear me, an old man, as I pray. Stop this warrior called Patroclus, for his army, our whole army, he does slay. By Zeus, may," et cetera, et cetera. And I'll never forget this. Eric, our music teacher, suddenly said to me, "Well, what should we do? How should the music go?" And it was as if, for the first time, one of my only times in my life, I was struck by the muse, and I just closed my eyes, and I went, oh, here's how it goes. It goes, "O mighty Zeus, king of Olympus, hear me, an old man, as I pray. Stop this warrior called Patroclus, for our whole army he does slay. By Zeus, let his death be near, by my son bold Hector's spear. Sacrifice to you we will, if he keeps this butcher from the kill." Now, it wasn't great words. We were 12 years old, but it was, an incredible experience.
Yeah, they're great words, Margot. They brought tears to my eyes, even by old age.
Well, so, I was very involved at the age of 12 with the gods, And I think that was my entry. That was really my entry into paganism. And I think at the time at that time I didn't know if I wanted to worship them or I wanted to be them, part of me wanted to be the goddesses, I really saw Artemis and Athena as these images of one's highest self. It was kind of, I could use these images in some way in my own becoming. And I also knew very early, by the time I was 12 or 13, that you didn't go around saying that you, worship the Greek gods, or were trying to become them without ending up in a mental hospital. And so, very early in my life, I sort of took all that stuff, and I put it in a drawer and sort of pretended that this wasn't really part of my life. And by the time I was 14. It was 1960. I was 14, it was 1960, and, I was from a Jewish atheist Marxist home, and civil rights had happened, the civil rights movement was on, and I became very political very early. And I locked that whole spiritual dimension of my life in a psychic drawer. And I think I just pretended it didn't exist. And I became very, very active. I, was on marches, to desegregation, marches of Woolworth. In 1960, I went to Berkeley in 1964. I was arrested in the free speech movement. I went to Mississippi as a civil rights worker in 65. I went to Cuba on the Venceremos Brigade. I did all this stuff. I was in Chicago in 68, all this stuff. And all of that spiritual dimension of my life was sort of locked away. It was not there at all. And it wasn't until 1971, which was the year when everything came together for me. I was working in Washington, D.C. I was a political reporter working for Pacifica, the radical radio stations, and the first Earth Day had come, and I got very amazed by the environmental movement. I was very overwhelmed by it, and I started reading the environmental writers. I started reading Rachel Carson. I started reading René Dubos. I started reading Lauren Isley, and I started reading all these writers. And I remember I came across John McPhee's Encounters with the Archdruid, which was one of the most important books actually in my own becoming. And during this time, I suddenly realized I was feeling feelings of ecstasy as I was encountering these nature writers. I knew that the environmental movement was not, quote, merely a political movement, that I was feeling feelings of ecstatic connection to the ultimate as I was reading these writers. And I didn't have words for it. I didn't know quite how to speak about this, except I knew that somehow or another, the environmental movement was about the fact that everything is connected, that as John Muir said, when you pick out something by itself, you find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And I understood this from the environmental writers. And at that point, I came across Arnold Toynbee's essay, The Religious Roots of Our Environmental Crisis. And in that essay, Arnold Toynbee essentially says there is a problem within the Jewish and Christian traditions. There is this problem. And this problem is that there is this notion that, that we are nothing and God is above, and that the whole notion of subdue the earth and multiply and have dominion over the earth gives license for exploitation. And that the older, and here it was, the older pagan animistic traditions had a different notion of the sacred, that all was alive and vital and interrelated. And I read this, and it was like the light went on, and I went, oh, I'm a pagan, But what does that mean? I didn't know what a pagan meant, and I even did very funny things, like I went to England because, Encounters with the Archdruid, what are the Druids? I looked, I went to England and looked in the telephone book under D for Druid, I had no idea what I was doing. And I was reading and trying to figure out what this was. And, finally I went to England, and I found an occult guide to London. I'll never forget it. And in this occult guide, it had a couple of addresses, and one of them was the pagan movement of Ireland and Wales, and one of them was the Order of Pagans, Bards, and Druids. And I wrote them letters as any completely naive seeker, in which I said, dear folks, I'm looking for an ecological religion with a kind of holistic view of the earth. Are you it? And they wrote back things like, well, we don't know if we're it, but, for £2 you can subscribe to our magazine or whatever. And so there I was getting the waxing moon, coming to my door in 1971, in like the fall of 1971. And I was reading this magazine from England, and I had no idea what any of it meant. And it would say, at our Lughnasadh meeting, we did such and such. And I'd say, what is Lughnasadh, Or how to make your own athame. And I'd say, well, what is an athame? I have no idea what this is. And in the middle of this, these wonderful, odd witches from Essex, Sylvester and Doris Stewart, wrote me this letter. And they said, Dear Margot, we see you are a member of the pagan movement. And I went, I am not a member of the pagan movement. I haven't joined anything. I am still a Jewish Marxist atheist. I am not, this is what pagan movement, And then it said, my wife and I are high priestess and high priest of a coven of witches in Essex. And I literally dropped the letter to the floor, and it wasn't that I thought witches were evil. I wasn't coming from a Christian place that believed that witches were Satanists. I was coming from the Jewish Marxist atheist place, which knew that witches didn't exist. So I basically, I picked up the letter from the floor, and I opened it up and I read it, and it was actually a come-on. They were selling their rituals, which were basically stolen from somebody else. But anyway, they were selling these tapes of their rituals. And I wrote them back a letter, and I said, look, I have no money, but I have a radio show. I could play this game as well as anybody else. I said, if you send me a sample of your tape, I will put it on the air. So for a month, it was a big joke. I would laugh with friends, and I would say, you won't believe it, I'm corresponding with witches in Essex. Ha, ha, ha. Isn't this the funniest thing in the world? And it was a big joke. And the tape arrived, and I didn't have the right tape recorder and everything, and a month went by. And then one day, I put the tape on the right tape recorder at the right speed. And it was the drawing down of the moon. And it was the drawing down of the moon ritual. Beautifully done with English accents, so of course I was hooked, and Brahms in the background, so it was beautiful music, and there was this man saying, "Hear ye the words of the great mother who was of old, also called Artemis," and all the names I had used when I was 12, and I started convulsively crying, convulsively sobbing. She started speaking, I was convulsively sobbing, you know, I who am the beauty of the green earth and the white moon among the stars and the mystery of the waters. And I realized that she was an adult. She was not in a mental hospital. She was all right. She had allowed this into her life, and she was all right. And that meant that I was all right. And that I could open up the door. I could open up that psychic door and allow that into my life. And that is basically how I got involved in all this.
You would be amazed at how many people that write to us, get our first literature. We often never hear from them again, but they say it's like coming home. It's that epiphany experience that says, yes, what I'm doing is all right. We get thousands of those people.
I get them
it's
also.
unreal.
I get them, you know, I get people writing to me because of my book. And that is the most frequent thing. You know, I found your book in the such and such South Carolina Public Library. I always thought I was the only one. You know, or, I mean, this letter. I am a 14-year-old high school student from a very conservative, I go to a Catholic school in Chicago or whatever. Every morning I wake up at 5 o'clock. I have to take the bus 2 hours into Chicago to basically go to school. One day I was out, it was still black at night, and I started looking up at the moon. And I realized that there was a presence there, a female presence there. I don't know what to do about this. I don't, you know, I get letters like that all the time. All the time. And it is that powerful, it's very interesting because it's not a conversion experience. That's the key thing. It's not. It's a coming home to something you always were, you always knew you were from the very, very beginning. It's, oh, I never knew this had a name. I've always believed this. And, you know, and it's a very powerful coming together that happens to people who get involved in this religion.
Gordon Melton says that we are the fastest growing religion in the world. We're doubling every 3 years. And because of that, of course, we're getting a lot of flakes and weirdos and all sorts of odd fringe people. And we seem to have a central core of people who are more disciplined. And yet we are a religion of nature and diversity. How do you see the future from the diversity versus the outlying regions? Will we ever become something which a government, for instance, can understand, or even the media, since you're in the media, can understand?
Well, I think the media, I mean, there are 100 answers to this question, and there are about 8 directions I want to go on this one. I'll just very quickly, I don't think the media can deal with religion at all, not even mainstream religion, let alone Wicca. I think that the real problem is that they're very scared of an experience that changes consciousness in any way. And I think that the media in general, they want it to be all nice and sort of rational. And the idea that people actually are having intimate experiences with the ultimate, you know, and are also living very normal lives. I mean, this is the thing that they can't. You either have to be a total crazed, you know, total crazed lunatic, or you have to be, you know, a person who goes to work as a computer programmer. You know, the idea. I mean, the thing that I love about the pagan religions altogether, about and this whole revival. Let me digress here completely and talk about not about the question that you asked, but let me talk about some other things first. I think that we are one of the only religions around, not that there aren't, actually there are responses that are progressive and liberal to all religions that allow people to live, you know, but I think that what's interesting is the core of the contemporary pagan movement is a religion that allows you to live with intellectual integrity as well as any explorations you may have about the occult, and it allows you to wake up the next morning and go to work as a doctor, as a lawyer, or whatever you're going to do, and also dance around a bonfire and completely get out of yourself, for 5 hours. And you can, why should the holy rollers be the only people who have the fun, right? I mean, let's get down to some basic things here. I think that one of the things that actually Aidan Kelly said years ago, which I think is brilliant, and all my disagreements with him with 1,000 things make nothing. This is one of the most brilliant things. He says, the craft, paganism, Wicca has an open metaphysics. It basically says there is always more, and it is not taken literally. And therefore, if you don't have a literal scripture, you can never have a creationism versus science dispute in paganism, because there is no literal scripture. And so the shamanic or pagan view would be, well, there's scientific reality, and that's true, and there's also, well, we were born because we came through such and such a creation myth. And you can hold both of these at the same time, and you can wander in and out of both realities and have, or 5 realities or 6 realities, and live with them together and hold them together. And I think, one of the things I want to say about I want to talk a little bit about, I came to paganism because it was beautiful and it fulfilled a lot of emotional and psychological needs. But intellectually, what I think is fascinating about paganism is this. We are growing up in a world where we are taught that religion is of the book. That there are, religion means scripture, it means creeds, it means it's universal, like Christianity and Islam and whatever, and that it involves hierarchy, involves all this other stuff. The ancients and the indigenous peoples of today have a completely different understanding of religion. And it's one that is part of our religious understanding too. And that understanding says, number one, that deity is multiple, that we are polytheists, that there is a kind of diversity. Now, I know you have some differences on this and everything, but there is a multiplicity about, not that the religious experience, I think, is very monotheistic. It's very one. This uniting with the one, this uniting with the ultimate. But the paths to it, the paths are absolutely multiple. And they depend a lot on culture. They are not universal. They depend, that's why, if you have they are rooted in place. The indigenous peoples understood that they had their own sacred mountains, their own sacred rivers. They didn't assume that they would ever proselytize to anybody else because their religion was in a location. It was based on a particular place where you were. And therefore, there was not supposed to be one religious truth. And similarly, I think that means there's not supposed to be one psychological truth. There's not supposed to be one political truth. There's not supposed to be one political system. And that, like ecology, in a very odd way, there are multiple species that live in interaction. And similarly, spiritual truth is like that. There's multiple spiritual paths and spiritual realities. And therefore, all the stuff that is getting our world in confusion today, the kind of, I think, fundamentalisms, where people are essentially killing each other for various political or religious one-wayisms, essentially all these fall by the wayside in the contemporary pagan perspective. So then on top of this is this notion that deity is alive in everything. And therefore it is that you yourself are part of the sacred, which means your body is part of the sacred. This world is part of the sacred. You don't have to die to get the good stuff, right? The good stuff is part of sacred reality here and now. That the sacred is right here, It's right here, and you don't have to, abase yourself. You don't have to say, oh my God, you don't have to bow down and grovel to some deity above. That doesn't mean that we ourselves are our high self all the time? No, we're full of, we're full of bullshit a lot of the time. That doesn't mean that we aren't subject to self-delusion, which I think is true of pagans as well as every religious person involved in a religious quest, that the threat, let's put it that way, or the pitfall of self-delusion is everywhere, including in our midst, I think. But I think that ultimately what's very exciting about the pagan resurgence is it basically says this is a religion without the middle person. This is a religion not based on prophets. It is, there is direct access. It is not based on written scripture. It is incredibly creative because you yourself are developing liturgy. It is involved in your own interaction with sacredness in yourself and in others and in the earth and in the universe. It is, an incredibly powerful, positive, and democratic, I think, religious format or belief system. And I think I think that's probably why, after I was smitten with it on an emotional level, I was also very powerfully affected by it, because even though I was, I came across all kinds of groups that were dogmatic and told me all kinds of stuff that was ridiculous, even some of the stuff that are our most cherished beliefs. When I was first in a group, they came up to me and they said, we believe in the threefold law. And I said, why not 2.5, and so, so there's a lot of dogmatisms even in our own beliefs, systems. But I think the basic thrust of it is incredibly powerful, incredibly democratic, incredibly positive, and again allows us to live a life with intellectual integrity as well as a deep spiritual base.
We couldn't have said it better ourselves, and we don't disagree with anything you said. We really could. We really agree with every single thing you said.
Really?
Everything
Really?
is
Really?
obviously sacred.
Right.
I think the point at which it comes apart for us is we have a belief in an ultimate deity which is beyond the gods and goddesses that we tend to think of as things that we make.
Well, I think I probably don't completely disagree with you. I probably don't completely disagree with you there either, in the sense that I think the ultimate is unknowable, is deeply unknowable, and we approach it through whatever way we can, and because we are.
Go on, just because
going,
it all
right.
fell on the floor, it's still working.
And because we are humans, our images are very often human images and so forth, and they are ways that we approach this, yes. And I think that, looking at this altar over here, I'm not worshiping this image, I'm not worshiping. This image is a doorway. It is a doorway. I mean, one of the things that I remember reading, Theodore Roszak in Where the Wasteland Ends, wrote that very often people, people have a problem with idolatry, and I, coming from an atheist, somewhat semi-Jewish, non-Jewish home, I, was given the story of Hanukkah, and there were, the dull natives, bowing down to these idols, and there were sort of the pure Jews who worship the one God and so forth, and I, so that when I first came across all these altars, I went, altars? Oh, what's this ugga-bugga? And I still find in workshops that I do around the country, a lot of people have issues about altars because they say, oh, what is this? Isn't this idolatry? And I remember reading Theodore Roszak in Where the Wasteland Ends, and he says, that's a racist perception because it assumes that so-called primitive people had less profound experiences with the ultimate. And these images were always for those who were profound in any time and any, they were always doorways. They were doorways into the ultimate and, the ultimate unknowable, essentially. And so, just like I think, this brings us into another subject which I really want to talk about. Ritual, for me, is probably why I got involved in paganism, ultimately, as I said in the beginning, as well as the fact that I'm a frustrated singer whose politically left parents never let her join the Girl Scouts, and so therefore all of my workshops probably degenerate into singing, and we have great times and so forth. But besides that, I love ritual, and I've spent a lot of time trying to think what it is about ritual that is so powerful, and why, and how to distinguish between ritual that really works and the dry, formalized experiences that turn off people when they think about the word ritual. Because in our culture, so many people have been have a notion, the ritual is that horrible July 4th celebration they went to, when they had to sit with all their relatives, or, the Thanksgiving parade that they hated after the third minute or whatever. And for me, ritual is about, well, it's a way of ending our alienation from each other, our alienation from the earth, our alienation from our true selves. And I think what it is it is a series of steps, a series of tools, you might call it a sacred technology that's been passed on through thousands and thousands of years, of a series of very simple techniques that allow us to return to the place that in fact we always are, that place of ultimate connection with everything that we in fact forget about as we live our lives in the world of concrete. So we forget about that connection that we are always in, that state of at-oneness and attunement with the universe. And we need certain things to get us back there. And so song and chant does that. Candles do that. Incense does that. Drum beats do that. Meditations do that. Dance and gesture does that. And I remember, I think it actually was some British witch. I'm not exactly sure who it was. It actually may have been Maxine Sanders, who once said, "When the table is set, it's tea time." And I've always thought that that was an extremely wonderful, wonderful thing to say about ritual, that a lot of what ritual is simply setting the table so that you can be who you really need to be in that setting. You can essentially let down your barriers. You can come home to yourself and to the person who you really are when you throw off the sort of dross of the society and all of that stuff. And another, I think another witch that I remember, I think it may have even been Doris Stewart, once said to me, she said, it's very much like the ancient toast. The ancient toast, of course, has gotten completely perverted because, it's just cheers, let's have a drink. But if you think about the toast, well, what do? Well, you take the cup and you look at the cup and your eyes get centered and your eyes focus. And then what do? Well, you take it up to your nose and you smell the drink, and, your nose, that sense gets very, very centered and focused. And then, of course, you clink the glass, and your ears then focus, and you're touching the glass, so that sense is brought into play. And finally, when you drink, ultimately, you are in a centered, different place. So in some sense, the toast recapitulates the entire history of ritual. And it's the first thing that I tell people when I'm teaching a workshop on ritual. And then I talk about the Eightfold Paths and how, there are many different paths to get there, that people have used, from sex and drugs to essentially dance. But the ones that we'll use will not probably be those, but will be dance and chant and so forth and so on. But I think ultimately there is that place that we all felt when we were 3 years old. It's the place that gets awakened in emergency. It's, the famous story of, the mother sees her child and she runs, and suddenly with superhuman strength she lifts the car, up and rescues her child. Well, that's in us, right? But it's not in us all the time, because it's not in us most of the time. So I think ritual allows us in a gentle way, without, dying or being in emergency or whatever, to access those parts of ourselves, that, altered state or whatever you want to call it, that deeper place. And it allows us to essentially function to reawaken what I might call the artistic, the dream part of us, the artistic part, the creative part of ourselves. And ritual allows us to do that.
I think the thing that wakens ritual in me, would you believe, is when I smell burning sulfur. Because every time we close the circle, we close it with a line of sulfur, and we burn a little and threaten all those things that they're not to come in here.
Well, it's funny, because that brings up a whole other question, which is, I remember when I was doing my book, the issue came up about spontaneity in rituals versus doing, the same thing over and over and over. And I remember interviewing a Gardnerian witch who said to me, I love the fact that on a full moon, when I do a ritual, I know that there are people all over the world doing that same ritual over and over, and that I can go into, I can walk into England, or I can walk into France, and I can walk into, and I can be home in that place. And I think she had actually a very, very valid point, that there is something to be said if you're talking about creating a safe space where you can unlock those parts of yourself. You do need, it is true that certain things are pathways for you, are keys for you to open yourself, so that a song or a particular way of casting the circle, or I remember that there was, in the first tradition I ever got involved in, which was sort of a Welsh-oriented group, they had this wonderful thing, who knows where it came from, but they had this wonderful thing at the end where they just said, fire, seal the circle round, let it fade beneath the ground, let all things be as they were from the beginning of time. You say that was sort of their way of grounding at the end. It was so beautiful, I've used it very, very many times. And so I really believe that. On the other hand, some of the hottest, most energetic rituals that I've ever been in were some of the rituals that were these, during the sort of thrust of the feminist movement, when feminist spirituality was sort of happening, and right in the mid-70s, and all these women were getting together for the first time. There was some of the most explosive energy I had ever experienced. It was just incredible.
Don't you find some of the people who read your book actually do get into some altered state of consciousness and have difficulty thereafter?
Well, now, it's very interesting, because my book is a very sort of scholarly book, so it's not like I've given them rituals to do, and the question is, in workshops and stuff, does this happen? And actually, I've been incredibly lucky. It's happened very, very, almost never, and I think it's because I'm very gentle. I really am always telling people, I'll tell you, it was very interesting. I once took a workshop with Jean Houston. It was very interesting and fascinating to work with, but I'll never forget it. She did this workshop, and she had us become, she was doing sort of the Osiris, she was doing the Osiris being cut up into little pieces, little thing, and she had everybody sort of becoming Osiris cut up into little pieces and sacrificing themselves. And I'm like in this meditative stage, and I'm saying, no way, honey, I'm not sacrificing myself. I'm not cutting myself into little pieces. And I realized that there were a lot of people in that room who might well have just gone ahead but didn't want to, because nowhere in the exercise did she say, you have complete free will. This is something you do, only do what feels right. Every minute of the day, in every workshop I do, for example, I say, if you want to leave, you cut yourself a doorway. You can cut yourself a doorway and leave and go to the bathroom. If you have to get out, you can always leave, even if we're in the most important ritual that we're doing here. You have to feel you have the right to leave. And anybody who puts you in a situation where you don't have the right to leave, you should just, you should just tell them where to go, because then they are essentially manipulating your will against your will, and manipulating you against your will. So I am very, very careful to give people their own power. I think, this is something where they are there to discover their own abilities and their own power. And I am very unleader. I am a ritual leader in that sense, and I have a certain presence. But I'm always very much. I'm very. I'm on in a ritual, but I'm always very much. We're here together in this, and you have the right. And also when we go on a trance journey, whenever we go someplace beautiful, I will always say to them, you can come back here anytime you want, because you have created this. So I have actually had very few instances that have been where crazies have come into my workshops. I've been incredibly either lucky or whatever. The weirdest thing I ever had, the weirdest experience I ever had, and it is the one that it was so horrendous that it really did freak me out for about a year, and it made me gun shy for about a year, is I was involved in a conference on religion and spirituality with a lot of reasonable folk like Harvey Cox and, you know, at Harvard and all these other kind of things. And we all gave keynote speeches, and we were all talking very personally. And Harvey Cox, to be, I think, provocative, suddenly brought up the question of evil. And it was as if, in being provocative, he decided to sort of, I don't know, he stirred it up in the audience. You know, he stirred it up. And he said to me, well, Margot, what is your view about evil? And I said, you know, I have to tell you that even though I live in New York City and what people think is the hellhole of the universe, you know, I have only come across evil as an absence in my life. I've come across an absence of empathy, an absence of this, that, and the other. I very rarely come across people who are, you know, a presence of evil. And he said to me, well, that's such a secular humanist view, you know, of yours, etc. You know, a real pagan would believe evil is forces and this, that, and the other, you know. And so we started talking, and then suddenly from the audience, as if he had like turned the spigot on, various women got up and started talking about their ritual abuse stories. And I got up and went far beyond what I should have. I just said what I believed, you know, that that a lot of this, that most of this was bogus, that essentially, and I gave examples. I said that I, you know, subscribed to a newsletter from that I get a lot of gossip in called the Lesbian Connection, and there were 10 letters from women who said that they were ritually abused, and one of them said she'd had 10 babies taken from her and sacrificed. And I said, well, when you hear a story like that, you at least want to know if somebody's seen her pregnant. And well, the women in the audience, the three of them were outraged, and they came up to me and they said, you know, how can you support the perpetrators? You know, how can you use the spirituality conference to support the perpetrators? And I said, because, you know, speaking, you know, as someone involved in Wicca, you know, this stuff is being used to essentially, you know, blame us for a lot of stuff. And if you talk to the FBI, you will find that there's very little going on. I'm not saying that there isn't an occasional case of a sick individual here and there, but the kind of stuff that people are talking about, this is not happening. And I said, and I want to tell you something else. I have a neighbor of mine who was diagnosed as a multiple personality and had a lot of therapy. And one day her therapist, she comes to me and she says, my therapist just handed me this sheet of the satanic holidays and told me these are dates that I might have more trouble around. Speaking of suggestion. And this is a woman who never said that she's with a New York therapist. And I looked at this document, and I had a friend of mine who investigates cults analyze it, and it comes from the Christian right. You know, and so there's a New York therapist in New York handing out information from the Christian right and saying that, you know, this is, et cetera, et cetera. So I said all this, you know, and then a very odd thing happened. I went and had lunch. The women came up to me. I had lunch with one of them. We talked and talked. I gave her my view. She gave her, you know, all that kind of stuff happened. The next day, my part of the thing was over, and I went and took a wonderful singing workshop with this guy who was part of this conference, Nick Page, who does power singing, fabulous stuff. And we were singing ritual things and spirituals, and we were slapping each other's hands and this, that, and the other. And one of the women was there in the workshop, and I didn't even remember it, you know, notice it, whatever. And I was just going like this and this and the other, and I, you know, may have grazed her hand. And 4 days later, I got a letter in the mail from her saying that I had sexually abused her at this workshop, and she was reporting me to the head of the workshop, and that, you know, did I normally abuse other women, and that I was clear from my political statements in the morning before that I was denying either that I had my abuse history of either being abused or an abuser. Well, luckily, the person who runs the conference was in the room during this entire saga, so saw exactly what was going on, so there was like no problem in the end. Everything, you know, I wrote her a letter, everything got stopped. But I suddenly went, whoa, and I started having some very interesting thoughts as a result. And here's what I ended up thinking. We here, in this religion, have made it, and also particularly in feminist spirituality, this is true a lot, we have believed, and with some very good reason, that the doorway to everything is the personal statement. You know, that from one's own, the personal is political, from one's own personal experience comes all truth, right? And therefore, I think we can very easily be a prey to self-delusion. because the fact is, sometimes what we think and what we do or whatever isn't. It comes from our dream reality, or it comes, one of my best friends one of my very good friends is Whitley Strieber. Do I believe he's had alien experiences? I have no idea, but it could easily be that he's one of these people who, is the links between this world and the other world are not as fixed, Maybe it's not aliens, So I think we have to be very careful. I think there is a way in which, sometimes a table is only a table, or as Freud said, sometimes a cigar is only a cigar. And I think that one of the things that we really have to be very careful of, particularly in a religion that has an occult, a big occult component, and that believes that there is, a spirit world and there is another world, we have to be very, very careful about how we deal with things that are rational and, and how we kind of balance ourselves. I think, if we are not in balance, we are, in deep trouble. And I think that more than the question of do we need discipline or do we need this, I think the question is, can we make sure that people who come to this learn the techniques to become balanced individuals? I mean, that is absolutely key.
We have just got back from Korea, and there they have the Manshin, the shaman, 7,000 registered shaman in Seoul alone. To become a registered shaman, they have tests. Like if you're going to be a speaker in tongues, you have to speak in tongues to a foreigner for half an hour. And they have other tests for climbing and jumping on knives and things to show that you really are in an altered state of consciousness, that you really are in contact with something. I think it's impossible to dogmatize and say that sort of thing should be done for the whole community, because, as we say, we're like cats. Herding cats is impossible. We have catna, not dogma. But I often think that we do need some test for these people who claim to be doing things, because we've had trance mediums tell other people that those frosts are doing these weird things, and they've got this information from trance. Now that's spectral evidence, and we outlawed that in something. We've only brought it back because of the children's clinics, I guess. But we agree 100%. You do need some training.
And I think, besides training, a lot of it has not to do with training. Although I think training is very important, but I think there's another aspect, and that is how invested you are in some of this stuff, and how much of an actual grounded life on the earth plane you actually have. I mean, one of the real problems that I have is that many of the people, just don't have lives other than the craft. And so it becomes everything to them. And, it's like they live or die over some little political battle or some little other thing that happens, and it's like, God, it's the most crazy thing. And I tell you, I swear to God, if they had, or goddess, or whatever, I swear if they had, a job, children, a few things that would just basically crown them to the world, they would be in a lot better shape, and automatically. And I mean, I hate to say that to people, get a life, but I don't even like it when people say that kind of expression, but there is a certain truth to it, particularly people who make their whole life the magic racket. I'm going to really be loved for this tape. Oh, my God.
You're in as much trouble as we are, that. About 20% of students have advanced degrees, and about 20% have no high school diploma.
Of whose students?
Of the students of the church and school.
Right.
And so that shows the tremendous range of people. And there's no guarantee that because they have an advanced degree that they're holding a job.
Right.
And the other thing we find is we have bunches of age groups, like 20 years old, 36 years old, 55 years old. That's where the peaks are.
What are the ages again?
20, 36, 55. The last one is when they're beginning to worry about dying. 36 is that menopausal men and women change of life thing. The 20 is when they get to school and find all these other people are living okay without the fundamentalist book.
Well, I'll tell you something, you know, in the women's movement, it's particularly amazing. Some of the best people you get are the people who, you know, had their sort of traditional life and then threw it all up. And they're usually, you know, they're usually in their 50s or 60s. And they've gone through, you know, all this stuff, and then they threw it out, they became lesbians, or they did whatever they did, but, you know, they've suddenly, and you meet them, and they've just seen enough of life so that they can just tell you, hey, you know, I mean, part of me thinks, you know, once you're past 40, you really, you know, you have to get on with your life, you know. It's fine to be in a recovery group, you know, for 5 years, for 10 years, but there's a time where you finally, you know, get on with it, and now that, you know, and don't use it like Freudian therapy, you know. So there's a certain, you know, so I see these wonderful, strong women, and some men too at this, but really incredible women. And I'll tell you a very interesting thing that I did, and I've been doing in a workshop. I actually saw this once, and I started doing it in a lot of workshops. I would have people stand in a circle according to age, with like the oldest, second oldest, third, all the way to the youngest. And then the second oldest has to honor the eldest. Here there's a chant, but you honor it any way you want. You can, whatever feels right, you can bow down, you can whatever, you can take their hand, whatever. And then the third does it to the second and to the eldest. And finally the youngest is doing it to every single one. And I've had a couple of instances where doing that ritual, which sometimes it lasts 20 minutes, but sometimes I've had a group of 20 people where it lasted like an hour and a half. And at the end of it, people said, you know, well, of course, many of the women said, I've never been honored before. I've never had the feeling of what it's actually like to be honored. And so women would be sobbing and would be having, but then there were other women who said, I've never experienced really what it's like to honor somebody, and to actually honor somebody who's older, and to really experience what honoring is like, and so forth. And so, you know, this is something in our culture, you know, it's something that it's very good to learn. Another thing that's very interesting is, what's her name? Vicki Noble has a ritual that's wonderful. She takes a group and she teaches them a chant. It's beautiful. It's like, you know, we are opening up in sweet surrender to the luminous love light of the One. We are opening, we are opening, we are opening. Anyway, she sings this chant. She teaches the chant, which has harmonies. It's really beautiful. And then she has a group of people do it for an hour. Nothing else, but do it for an hour, except that she has some people lie down on the floor and you can do sort of healing, and then for 15 minutes you can get up and other people can sit down. But part of the ritual is just simply that in our culture we don't do things for long enough time. You know, if you look at Native American rituals, they go on for hours and hours and hours and hours, and people actually get to do them, you know? And so it's just an experience, to have an experience of what would it be like to do that for an hour. You know, or what would it lead to honor people? You know, there's a lot of stuff in our culture that we don't. And so part of learning, you know, when you're getting back to your whole thing about training, I think training is important, but I think it's a lot of people, you know, are setting up schools and training, and I'm not sure whether it's what I think. You know, who knows if what they're training is what I would think of training, or I think part of training is just being around a long enough time, you know, and essentially getting your life together and then starting doing stuff and doing it again and again and again. And after you've done it for a certain amount of time, you're there, you know. It's not a very scientific way of doing it, but I don't know.
Yeah, when we teach, we make them read a bunch of outside books, of course, which say, hey, you know, to get the other views too.
Right.
But honoring is really intriguing because, of course, the Native Americans honor everything. Mm-hmm. The honoring that the Mohawk do before a ritual takes like 3 hours because they honor everything, water, sky, earth, right. And they honor water in 43 different ways. So we went up to a mega institute one time to teach tantric yoga. Tantric yoga, mind you, to a bunch of people who were into yoga. And the first thing I wanted everybody to do was have all the men honor the women. And you know, everybody dropped out of the class except 3 couples. Every single person except 3 couples of these New Age crystal-pushing yoga types. They couldn't stand it. They couldn't stand it.
That's
but a couple of the women came over afterwards and said, you know, I wouldn't have dropped out. I really enjoyed that.
Oh, right.
I don't know what else, except you've got to sing us something.
Oh, what should I sing you?
Something light and nice and...
Like
you know,
nicer or heavier?
Laughter, because if we can't have laughter in the religion and fun, you know... All right, you can do a serious one and then do a light one.
Well, how about an outrageous one?
That's great.
You want an outrageous one?
Absolutely outrageous.
See if I can remember it.
Because
This
you're
was
not going to
written
have
by
trouble
a
with
woman. Oh, and I feel terrible because I don't remember her name. She's from Chicago, and I've forgotten her name. Who wrote this? I feel terrible. But anyway, let me see if I can remember it. It's very outrageous. The chorus is, we can do battle with demons and angels. Our weapons, earth, fire, water, and air. We are resisting the newest dark age with old witches' wisdom and goddesses' rage. Isis, Astarte, Diana, and I have decided to get up and fight. That little boy upstart who's blocking the sky will have to move over. He's a block in the light, and we can do battle with demons and angels. Our weapons, earth, water, fire, and air. We are resisting the newest dark age with old witches' wisdom and goddesses' rage. This violation of all that is holy. Oh, I've forgotten. Wait. There's plenty of manner of being to whom we might happily pray. There are so many ways to be loving and giving. There never was, there never should be only one way. And we can do battle with demons and angels. Our weapons, earth, water, fire, and air. We are resisting the newest dark age with old witches' wisdom and goddesses' rage. This violation of all that is holy must stop. It's gone on too long. Voices of joyous rebellion are swelling. The power of life is again growing strong. We can do battle with demons and angels. Our weapons, earth, water, fire, and air. We are resisting the newest dark age with old witches' wisdom and goddesses' rage. That's going to get me in trouble.
Not with this publisher. I think it's great. That's about all, my dear, and
okay.
Thank you so much.
Well,
I mean,
it was fun. God knows.
Really, it's really going to be great.